A child and her single mother waited outside the hospital, but the Mafia boss sat down instead of walking away. Before we dive into this soul-stirring journey of redemption and hope, please take a moment to join our family by hitting the like button, subscribing, and sharing this story with someone who needs to believe in miracles today. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, because here, we are one family bound by the stories that heal us, and your support helps us keep sharing these moments of light. A pale winter sun hung behind a thick curtain of clouds, casting a gray chill over the steps of the children's hospital where the scent of antiseptic and frozen earth lingered in the air. On a stone bench outside the main entrance sat Aurora Bellucci, a 25-year-old mother whose world had narrowed down to the rhythmic, rattling struggle of the child sitting right beside her. Aurora's long, white blonde hair escaped her ponytail in soft, silken strands, framing a face pale with exhaustion and a quiet beauty that only survives through sheer resilience. She wore a long brown coat over a simple pale dress, her shoulders hunched as she wrapped her arms around her own body to ward off the biting wind that swept across the courtyard. Sitting just inches away on the same cold stone was 2-year-old DeRosa, her tiny head topped with flaxen hair that matched her mother's, peeking out from a cream-colored cardigan. The toddler's cheeks were flushed a deep, feverish crimson, the unmistakable mark of the pneumonia that had turned her lungs into a battlefield. Aurora sat in a heavy, suffocating silence, her lips pressed tight as she fought to keep her soul from fracturing right there on the concrete. DeRosa, though she could not yet find the words to explain the fire in her chest or the weight in her mother's heart, felt every tremor of Aurora's pain. With a tiny, trembling hand, the baby reached into the pocket of her small sweater and pulled out a wrinkled white handkerchief. In the corner, the word Mama was stitched in clumsy pink thread, a labor of love Aurora had once crafted, now being returned by a 2-year-old who knew only how to love back. DeRosa reached up, her small fingers brushing a stray tear from Aurora's cheek, and she uttered the only bridge she had to the world. "Mama," she whispered, her voice a soft, raspy breath that broke the silence like a prayer. Aurora's face crumbled, her forehead dropping as she looked down at the small girl sitting bravely beside her, and for a moment, they were alone in their shared survival. Just a few steps away, the heavy hospital doors hissed open and Darius Esposito stepped out, his presence slicing through the gray morning like a sharpened blade. He was draped in a tailored pinstripe suit that spoke of absolute power, but it was the thick, intricate tattoo climbing his neck and disappearing beneath his jaw that told the true story of a man born of shadows and blood. He walked with a brisk, lethal grace, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he headed toward a waiting line of black sedans. His best friend and right-hand man, Albert Simone, walked a pace behind, checking a watch and whispering about a meeting that couldn't wait. But then, Darius's eyes drifted toward the bench. He stopped dead. He saw the white blonde hair of a mother who had reached her limit and the tiny, flushed face of a child sitting separately, but holding a handkerchief like a holy relic. The raspy Mama carried on the wind, piercing the armor Darius had spent a lifetime building. Darius froze, his hand dropping from his car keys as he stared at the pair. Aurora looked up, startled by the towering shadow of a man who looked like the very personification of danger, and she instinctively tensed, bracing for a world that had always taken more than it gave. But DeRosa didn't look away. She stared from her spot on the bench, her glassy, fever-bright eyes meeting the Mafia boss's gaze with a haunting, ancient soulfulness that demanded he stay. Darius didn't say a word to Albert, who stood confused by the sudden halt in their world. Instead, the man the city feared most walked toward the stone bench and sat down. He didn't ask for permission. He simply took his place on the far end of the stone, letting his tattooed hand rest on his knee and sharing the cold air with them, his silent presence offering a strange, heavy protection. After a long moment of shared silence, Darius stood up without a word to Aurora and motioned for Albert to follow him back inside the hospital lobby. "Clear it," Darius commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that left no room for question. Albert looked at the woman and child on the bench, and then back at the man who rarely showed mercy. "Clear what, boss?" Albert asked, though he already knew the answer. "Every cent. The admission, the treatment, the specialists, everything that child needs to breathe again." Darius snapped, his eyes fixed on the glass doors. "Do it anonymously. She doesn't need to know it's the devil paying her bills." Albert nodded, moving toward the billing desk with the efficiency of a man used to moving mountains. Minutes later, a nurse approached the bench where Aurora was still sitting in the cold. The nurse held out a discharge slip and a receipt, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Ms. Bellucci? Someone has just settled your daughter's entire account," the nurse whispered, handing over the papers. Aurora's hands shook as she took the receipt, her eyes scanning the lines until they hit the signature at the bottom of the foundation's grant line. It didn't say anonymous. In a moment of rare, deliberate carelessness, or perhaps a silent message of accountability, the printed name of the donor was clear. Her heart stopped as she read the name that ruled the city's darkest corners, Esposito. She looked toward the parking lot, but the black sedans were gone, leaving behind nothing but the fading scent of expensive cologne and the realization that the man who had sat beside her was the same man who held the city in his grip. As she reached out to finally pull Rosa into her arms, the baby let out a small, relieved sigh, her feverish head resting against the mother who finally had a reason to hope, and for the first time in years, Aurora Bellucci didn't feel like she was fighting the winter alone. Aurora Bellucci stared at the receipt in her hand. The name Esposito burned into her vision like a brand. It was the name of the shadow that loomed over the city's docks and back alleys, a name whispered in fear, and yet it was the same name that had just granted her daughter a chance to breathe. Her heart thundered against her ribs, a chaotic mix of profound relief and a nauseating dread that chilled her more than the winter wind. She looked at Rosa, who was now resting in a warm hospital bed, her breathing slightly less labored thanks to the immediate intervention of the specialists Darius had summoned. Aurora knew she should be grateful, but the weight of blood money was a burden she wasn't sure her conscience could carry. Leaving Albert Simone to watch over the room, Aurora found herself walking through the sterile hallways, driven by a desperate need to find the man who had sat on that bench. She found him standing on a secluded balcony of the hospital, overlooking the gray skyline of a city he essentially owned. Darius Esposito didn't turn around when she approached. He seemed to sense her presence, his tall frame silhouetted against the dimming light, the tattoos on his neck visible even in the shadows. Aurora stopped a few feet away, her fingers trembling as she held out the receipt. "I can't take this," she said, her voice small but surprisingly firm. "I know who you are, Mr. Esposito. I know where this money comes from, and I won't have my daughter's life bought with the pain of others." Darius finally turned, his expression unreadable, his eyes cold and dark as the midnight sea. He didn't look offended. If anything, he looked weary. "It isn't a bribe, Ms. Bellucci," he said, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that vibrated in the small space. "It's a payment. Think of it as a tax I've decided to pay back to a world I've taken too much from." Aurora shook her head, her white blonde hair catching the faint light of the hallway. "It's blood money. My husband. He was a good man, a hard worker. He died in an accident at the docks 3 years ago. Everyone knew your people were behind the construction negligence there. You didn't care about the families then. Why start now?" The air between them grew heavy, the silence stretching until it felt like it might snap. Darius looked away, his gaze falling back to the city below. 3 years ago, I thought power was the only thing that could protect a family, he began, his voice dropping an octave, losing its sharp edge. I was wrong. While I was busy securing territories and settling debts, I missed the call that my own daughter, Sarah, had been rushed to the ER. She was 4. A heart defect we didn't know she had. He paused, his jaw tightening so hard the muscles in his neck strained against his tattoos. By the time I walked through those hospital doors, the doctors were already pulling the sheet over her face. I had all the money in the world, and I couldn't buy her a single extra minute of breath. I failed her because I was too busy being a king of a kingdom made of ash. Aurora's anger faltered, replaced by a sudden, sharp pang of empathy that she hadn't expected to feel for a man like him. She saw the ghost of a father in the eyes of the monster. "I saw you on that bench today," Darius continued, finally looking back at her. "I saw the way your daughter looked at you. I saw that handkerchief. In that moment, I wasn't a boss. I was just a man who remembered what it felt like to watch his world go cold." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming but no longer threatening. "You can call it blood money if you want. You can hate me for where it came from. But don't punish DeRosa for my sins. She has a chance to get better, and I have a chance to ensure one less mother has to walk out of this building alone. Let me do this, not for you, but for the man I should have been." Aurora looked down at the paper in her hand. She thought of DeRosa's raspy mama and the feverish flush of her cheeks. She realized that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, and that perhaps, in the strangest of ways, her daughter's illness had provided a path for a broken man to find a shred of his lost humanity. She didn't say she forgave him, and she didn't promise to forget his name, but she slowly lowered her hand and tucked the receipt into her coat pocket. Darius gave a single, curt nod, the mask of the Mafia boss sliding back into place as he walked past her toward the exit. He didn't look back, but as he disappeared into the shadows of the corridor, Aurora felt a shift in the atmosphere, a heavy, silent understanding that their lives were now irrevocably entwined in a dance of debt and redemption. Aurora Bellucci returned to the hospital room, where the steady hum of the heart monitor provided a rhythmic assurance that DeRosa was winning her battle against the pneumonia. The toddler was finally asleep, her small chest rising and falling with a freedom she hadn't known for days. Aurora sat in the bedside chair, but her mind was far from restful. It was caught in the gravitational pull of the man she had met on the balcony. To settle her racing thoughts, she reached into her bag and pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook, the one thing she had refused to sell even when the rent was months overdue. Writing was her secret sanctuary, the only place where she wasn't just a grieving widow or a struggling mother, but a woman with a voice that could command the stars. She began to write, her hand moving in a frantic blur, capturing the raw emotion of the day, the coldness of the stone bench, and the inexplicable weight of Darius Esposito's presence. She was so deeply lost in the ink that she didn't hear the heavy door swing open, nor did she notice the shadow that fell across her pages until a low, gravelly voice broke her concentration. "You have the hands of an artist, but the eyes of a soldier," Darius said, standing at the foot of the bed. Aurora jumped, instinctively snapping the notebook shut and pulling it to her chest as if it were a shield. Darius didn't apologize for the intrusion. He simply watched her with an intensity that made her feel as though he were reading the words right through the cover. "I didn't mean to pry," he continued, stepping closer into the soft light of the monitor. "But I saw you writing earlier, on the balcony after I left. You weren't just taking notes. You were escaping." Aurora looked down at the frayed edges of her notebook, her face flushing. "It's nothing. Just a way to keep from going crazy when the world gets too loud." Darius walked to the bedside table and set down a small, velvet-lined box he had been carrying. "The world is loud because it's full of people who have nothing to say. But you have a story that people need to hear." He pushed the box toward her with a single, tattooed finger. "I spent my life silencing people, Ms. Bellucci. I know the value of a voice better than most because I've spent so much energy trying to extinguish them." Aurora tentatively opened the box. Resting on a bed of white silk was a vintage fountain pen, its body made of deep obsidian and gold, heavy and cold to the touch. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, a tool designed for someone whose words carried the weight of history. "I can't take this," she whispered, though her fingers instinctively traced the smooth barrel. "It's too much." Darius shook his head, his gaze softening just enough to reveal the man beneath the monster. "It's just a pen, Aurora. But in your hand, it's a weapon. And right now, you're in a war for your daughter's future." He looked at DeRosa, then back at Aurora. "I've seen the way you look at this city. You see the cracks, the rot, and the beauty that survives in spite of it. Write it down. Tell the truth about the places people like me try to hide. The world needs your voice to remind it that even in the shadows, there is someone still fighting." He turned to leave, his pinstripe suit vanishing into the dim hallway. But he stopped at the door, looking back one last time. "Don't let the ink dry out if you run out. Albert will bring you more. Just don't stop telling the story." As the door clicked shut, Aurora picked up the pen. It felt perfectly balanced in her hand, a gift of iron and grace from the King of Shadows. She opened her notebook to a fresh page, and for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She felt like she was finally ready to speak. The golden nib of the fountain pen scratched across the paper with a rhythmic precision that felt like a heartbeat. In the quiet of the hospital room, lit only by the soft blue glow of the medical monitors, Aurora Bellucci began to weave a world where the monsters weren't born with claws, but with heavy crowns they never asked for. She wrote about a king of shadows who sat upon a throne made of cold, unyielding iron, a man who had built a kingdom so vast and so dark that he had eventually lost sight of the stars. In her story, the king wasn't evil by choice, but by survival. He had traded his warmth for steel, believing that a heart was merely a vulnerability that his enemies would exploit. He looked at Aurora, and for a fleeting moment, the coldness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. "You make the darkness look like a choice, not a curse," he whispered, his voice thick with a weight he hadn't shared with anyone since Sarah's funeral. He didn't thank her, and he didn't offer her more money. Instead, he simply stood there, a king who had finally found someone who knew the truth about his crown. In that shared, silent space, the seal on his heart didn't just break. It shattered, leaving behind a man who was finally ready to face the light. Days passed, and the hospital room began to feel less like a waiting room for tragedy and more like a sanctuary for a new, fragile life. DeRosa was recovering, her breathing deepening and the feverish flush finally fading into the soft glow of health. But as her strength returned, her curiosity grew. She spent her hours looking at the bare white walls, her 2-year-old mind craving the colors and stories her mother often whispered to her in the dark. Darius Esposito noticed. He noticed everything. The way Aurora's books were stacked precariously on the floor, the way Rosa's tiny fingers reached for anything she could hold, and the way the sterile environment seemed to stifle the very spirit they were trying to save. One morning, Darius arrived not in his usual pinstripe suit, but in a heavy black work shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the full extent of the tattoos that mapped out his violent history. He wasn't carrying a briefcase or a weapon. Instead, he carried several planks of raw, sweet-smelling cedar and a heavy toolbox that clattered with the weight of iron. Aurora watched from the bed where she was reading to DeRosa, her eyes widening as the most feared man in the city cleared a space in the corner of the room. He didn't ask for permission, and he didn't offer an explanation. He simply knelt on the floor, his large, scarred hands moving with a surprising, practiced grace. The sound of the saw and the rhythmic strike of the hammer replaced the mechanical beep of the monitors. Aurora watched, mesmerized, as the man who had ordered cleanup operations now meticulously sanded the edges of the wood to ensure there were no splinters that could hurt a child's hand. This was a man who usually dealt in destruction, yet here he was, building. Every nail driven into the cedar felt like a stake in the heart of his past life. He wasn't just building a bookshelf. He was constructing a bridge away from the shadows he had occupied for so long. DeRosa watched from her bed, her wide eyes following the movement of his tattooed arms. At one point, Darius paused, holding out a small wooden peg toward the toddler. DeRosa reached out, her tiny hand brushing against his calloused palm as she took the wood, a silent pact of trust forming in the space between them. Aurora realized then that the weapons Darius was known for, the guns, the intimidation, the cold silences, were being systematically replaced by the tools of a protector. He was using the same hands that had built an empire of fear to create a small, humble home for a child's imagination. As the final shelf was slotted into place, the room was filled with the grounding scent of cedar. Darius stood up, wiping the sawdust from his trousers, and looked at the structure. It was sturdy, honest, and beautiful in its simplicity. He began to take Aurora's books and the few toys they had, and arrange them on the shelves, moving with a quiet reverence. He stopped when he reached a small, framed photo Aurora had kept tucked in her notebook, a picture of her husband. He looked at it for a long moment, his jaw tightening, before placing it in a position of honor on the top shelf. There was no more running from the ghosts. There was only the work of making room for them. When he was finished, he turned to Aurora, his gaze steady and stripped of its usual armor. "She needs a place for her stories," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "A child shouldn't have to live in a room with nowhere to put her dreams." Aurora felt a lump form in her throat, a mixture of gratitude and the terrifying realization that this man was becoming the foundation of their new world. She saw the sawdust in his dark hair and the sweat on his brow, and for the first time, she didn't see a mafia boss. She saw a man who was desperately trying to build a future out of the wreckage of his own memories, one shelf at a time. Darius didn't wait for her thanks. He simply packed his tools, leaving the room transformed, not just by the furniture, but by the undeniable proof that even the hardest of hearts can learn to build instead of break. The fragile peace of the hospital room was shattered in the hollow hours of 3 in the morning, a time when the world feels thin and the shadows seem to possess a weight of their own. It began with a sound that would haunt Aurora's dreams for years, a sharp, wet gasp from DeRosa followed by the frantic, high-pitched wail of the heart monitor. The pneumonia, which they thought had been retreating, had launched a final, vicious counterattack, sending the toddler into acute respiratory distress. Within seconds, the quiet sanctuary was flooded with the harsh glare of overhead lights and a swarm of medical staff. Aurora was pushed back against the cedar bookshelf Darius had built, her hands over her mouth as she watched the doctors work with a clinical, terrifying speed. They moved her daughter onto a gurney, the wheels clicking like a countdown on the linoleum, and raced toward the intensive care unit. Aurora followed as far as the heavy double doors of the ICU, but when they swung shut, she was left alone in the sterile, fluorescent silence of the hallway, her knees finally giving out as she collapsed against the wall. At that same moment, across the city in a high-rise boardroom that smelled of expensive leather and cold ambition, Darius Esposito was facing a different kind of life-or-death crisis. His empire was under siege. A rival syndicate had moved on his shipping lanes, and his own lieutenants were restless, their eyes gleaming with the predatory hunger that comes when a leader shows a hint of distraction. Albert Simone stood by the window, his phone buzzing incessantly. "Boss, the sit-down is in 10 minutes. If we don't show, they'll take the docks by morning. We lose the port. We lose everything we've built for 20 years. Darius sat at the head of the table, his fingers drumming a slow, rhythmic beat against the mahogany. His phone buzzed on the table. It was a single text from the nurse he had paid to watch Aurora. "ICU. Emergency." The air in the boardroom seemed to freeze. Darius looked at the maps spread across the table, the territory he had bled for, the empire that defined his very existence. He looked at Albert, who was waiting for the order to go to war. Then, he thought of the white blonde hair of a woman who had nowhere else to turn and a 2-year-old child who had wiped his cheek with a wrinkled handkerchief. "The docs don't matter," Darius said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm rumble. Albert froze. "Boss, if we walk away now, there's no coming back. They'll see it as a surrender." Darius stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor as he reached for his overcoat. "Let them take the wood and the stone, Albert. I've spent my life guarding things that can't love me back. I'm not missing another call." He walked out of the boardroom without a backward glance, leaving his empire to teeter on the edge of collapse. He drove through the city like a man possessed, ignoring the sirens and the red lights, his mind a storm of regret and a single, desperate prayer. When he reached the ICU hallway, he found Aurora exactly where he feared she would be, diminished, broken, and shivering on the floor. She looked up as his heavy, polished shoes clicked toward her, and for the first time, she didn't see the Mafia boss or the benefactor. She saw a man who had chosen her over a kingdom. Darius didn't say a word. He didn't offer empty platitudes or corporate reassurances. He simply knelt on the hard tile beside her, ignoring the smudge of dust on his pinstripe suit, and pulled her into a firm, grounding embrace. Aurora sobbed into his chest, her tears soaking the expensive wool of his coat, as he sat with her in the darkness. Outside, his world might have been burning to the ground, his power slipping away with every passing second, but inside that hallway, Darius Esposito had never felt more like a man of substance. He chose the hospital floor over the throne, his tattooed hand stroking Aurora's hair as they waited for the sun to rise, proving that some battles are won not with bullets, but with the courage to simply stay. The crisis in the ICU had passed like a fever dream, leaving DeRosa stable and Aurora floating in a state of exhausted gratitude. With the toddler finally in a deep, healing sleep under the watchful eye of the nursing staff, Aurora decided to do something she had avoided for weeks. She needed to see the world Darius Esposito inhabited when he wasn't sitting on hospital benches or building cedar bookshelves. She told herself it was to thank him properly, but deep down, a writer's intuition, a restless, nagging ghost, was pulling her toward the source of his shadows. She arrived at the Esposito Holdings, a towering monolith of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the very heart of the city's skyline. The security guards, usually stone-faced and immovable, stepped aside the moment they saw her white blonde hair, as if her face had been etched into their standing orders. She was directed to the top floor, a place of silent, plush carpets and a heavy, masculine scent of mahogany and old secrets. Darius was not in his office. Albert Simone had mentioned a brief meeting at the docks to assess the damage from the night he had walked away from his empire. Aurora stood alone in the vast, silent room, her eyes wandering over the shelves of leather-bound books and the floor-to-ceiling windows. On the corner of his massive desk sat the obsidian fountain pen he had given her, resting beside a heavy, silver-latched ledger. It was an old-fashioned book in a digital world, the kind of ledger used for things that were never meant to be stored on a server. Driven by a sudden, cold impulse, Aurora reached out. Her fingers brushed the cool leather, and she opened it, the pages filled with the meticulous, sharp handwriting of a man who tracked every debt and every soul he owned. She flipped through the pages, her heart beginning to hum with a frantic, rhythmic dread. She wasn't looking for financial figures. She was looking for names. And then, near the middle of a section dated 3 years prior, she saw it. The name jumped off the page and struck her with the force of a physical blow, Bellucci. Beneath it was a short, clinical entry detailing a structural intervention at the North Docks. There was a list of names of the men who had been working that shift, and beside her husband's name, there was a single, handwritten annotation in the margin: cleanup authorized. Minimal payout. Negligence file suppressed. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was the same sharp, decisive script that had signed the hospital receipt. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The man who had sat with her in the ICU, the man who had built her daughter a bookshelf and shared his grief about his own lost child, was the same man who had signed the order that turned her husband into a minimal payout. The accident that had shattered her life hadn't been an act of God or a twist of fate. It had been a calculated corporate move in a war for territory. Aurora felt the air leave her lungs, her vision blurring as she clutched the edge of the desk. She realized then that Darius hadn't found her by accident outside the hospital. He hadn't just been moved by a child with a handkerchief. He had been haunted by a debt he could never truly repay, and every kindness he had shown her was a brick in a wall he was building to hide the blood on his hands. She heard the heavy click of the office door opening. Darius stepped in, the scent of the winter wind still clinging to his black overcoat. He stopped the moment he saw her standing over the desk, his eyes falling to the open ledger. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that swallowed the entire city outside the window. He didn't rush to close the book, and he didn't offer a lie. He simply stood there, his face hardening back into the mask of the Mafia boss, though a flicker of something that looked like agony danced in the depths of his dark eyes. Aurora looked up at him, her face as pale as the snow falling outside, the leather-bound notebook of her own stories clutched to her chest like a shield. She didn't scream, and she didn't cry. She simply looked at the man she had begun to trust and saw, for the first time, the true cost of his empire. The ghost in the ledger had finally spoken, and the bridge he had built between them was beginning to crumble into the dark water of the docks. The silence in the office was a living thing, thick with the weight of 3 years of lies and the sudden, sharp clarity of the truth. Darius did not reach for the ledger, nor did he offer a word of defense as Aurora backed away from the desk, her white blonde hair shimmering like a halo of frost in the dim light. He saw the shift in her eyes, the transition from trust to the kind of hollowed-out horror that only comes from being betrayed by someone you were starting to love. He knew that no amount of cedar bookshelves or paid hospital bills could ever balance the scales of a man's life, and in that moment, the Mafia boss realized that his empire was not just a kingdom of ash, but a prison that would eventually kill everything good he tried to touch. Without a word, Aurora walked out, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet, leaving Darius alone with the ghost in the ledger and the crushing realization that his penance had to be as loud as his sins had been secret. 2 days later, the city was rocked by an event that would be talked about for decades. Darius Esposito, the man who had avoided every subpoena and outrun every indictment, did not flee. He did not hide behind high-priced lawyers or intimidating muscle. Instead, he called a press conference on the very steps of the Children's Hospital where he had first sat on a cold stone bench. Under the gray, watchful sky, surrounded by a forest of microphones and the flashing lights of 100 cameras, Darius stood alone. He wore his finest suit, the one that usually signaled a takeover, but his posture was that of a man surrendering to his own conscience. Behind him stood Albert Simone, whose face was a mask of stoic grief, knowing that this was the end of the world they had built together. Darius leaned into the microphones, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that silenced the buzzing crowd. He did not speak of business or politics. He spoke of the North Docks, of structural negligence, and of the names of the men whose lives had been traded for profit, specifically naming Aurora's husband. He confessed to the cleanup operations, the bribery of safety inspectors, and the systematic suppression of the families left behind. It was a public dismemberment of his own power, a deliberate choice to burn his legacy to the ground so that the truth could finally breathe. As he spoke, he looked directly into the lens of the primary news camera, as if he were speaking only to one woman in a hospital room a few floors above. He announced the immediate dissolution of the Esposito holdings, with every remaining asset being transferred into the De Rosa Legacy Foundation. a trust dedicated to providing unconditional medical care and financial support to single mothers and families devastated by corporate and criminal negligence. The city held its breath as the police, who had waited years for this moment, stepped forward. Darius didn't wait for them to reach him. He turned and offered his wrists, the metal of the handcuffs clicking shut over his tattoos in a final, rhythmic punctuation of his old life. He had traded his throne for a cell, his empire for a foundation, and his freedom for the chance to look himself in the mirror. As he was led away toward the waiting squad car, he saw a flash of white blonde hair near the hospital entrance. Aurora was standing there, holding a fully recovered 2-year-old DeRosa in her arms. She didn't wave, and she didn't smile, but she didn't look away. She watched him go, the notebook he had encouraged her to fill held tightly against her heart. Darius sat in the back of the car, the siren beginning to wail, but for the first time in his life, the King of Shadows felt like he was finally stepping out of the dark. He had lost everything the world valued, but as he caught one last glimpse of the child who had wiped his cheek with a handkerchief, he knew he had finally found the only thing worth keeping. The seasons turned with a gentle persistence, and the gray, biting winter that had nearly claimed DeRosa's life finally gave way to a soft, golden spring. In a quiet city park far from the cold stone steps of the hospital and the sterile silence of the ICU, a picnic blanket was spread across a sea of emerald grass. Aurora Bellucci sat in the warmth of the sun, her long, white blonde hair catching the light like spun silk as she looked down at the notebook in her lap. It was no longer a place for hiding ghosts. It was full of the stories she had written with the obsidian pen, tales of resilience that were now being published through the foundation Darius had built from the ruins of his empire. Beside her, 2-year-old DeRosa was a picture of vibrant health, her cheeks naturally rosy as she chased a butterfly, her laughter a clear, melodic bell that rang through the trees. The pneumonia was a fading memory, replaced by the strength of a child who had been given a second chance at a future. A shadow fell across the blanket, and Aurora looked up to see Darius Esposito approaching. He was no longer wearing the pinstripe suits of a king. He wore a simple dark sweater and jeans, his presence stripped of the lethal edge that once kept the world at bay. He had served his initial sentence, a period of intense legal scrutiny and the systematic dismantling of his old life, and he walked now with the gait of a man who was no longer running from himself. Albert Simone followed at a distance, carrying a basket of fruit and a small box of sweets, watching his old friend with a quiet, knowing smile. Darius sat down on the grass, his tattooed hand resting comfortably on his knee, and for the first time, his eyes were clear, reflecting the blue of the sky rather than the darkness of the docks. DeRosa stopped her play and ran toward him, her tiny feet thumping against the earth. Darius caught her with a practiced gentleness, lifting her into the air until she squealed with delight before settling her into the crook of his arm. The toddler looked at him, her glassy, fever-bright eyes from the winter now replaced by a sparkling, deep intelligence. She reached up and touched the tattoo on his neck, her fingers small and soft against the ink of his past. She looked from Darius to Aurora and back again, a profound, wordless understanding passing through her small heart. She leaned in, her flaxen hair brushing against his stubble, and whispered the words she had been practicing in the quiet moments of her recovery. "Daddy?" she asked, the question floating in the air like a gift. The world seemed to stop for a heartbeat. Darius froze, his breath hitching in his chest as the weight of that single word settled into the hollow spaces where his grief used to live. He looked at Aurora, his eyes searching hers for permission, for a sign that he was finally worthy of the title he had failed to hold once before. Aurora reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlocking with his, offering a silent, unconditional grace. She didn't say anything, but the softness in her expression told him everything he needed to know. Darius pulled DeRosa closer, his head bowing to touch hers, and a single, silent tear tracked through the dust on his cheek. They sat together in the grass as the afternoon light turned to honey, watching the clouds drift above them. No one talked about hospitals or ledgers or the missed opportunities of the past. They weren't bound by blood or the roles the world had once chosen for them. They were bound by the quiet power of presence and the courage to stay when walking away would have been easier. DeRosa eventually curled into the space between them, her fingers sticky from the sweets, while Darius and Aurora shared a look of profound, settled peace. The King of Shadows had finally found his home in the light, and as the screen of their lives faded to black, they were no longer characters in a tragedy, but a family defined by the love that grows when someone simply chooses to sit down. Thank you so much for walking this emotional path with us today. This journey of Aurora, DeRosa, and Darius is a powerful reminder that no matter how deep the shadows of our past may be, there is always a seat on the bench for redemption and a second chance at love. We want you to know that you are more than just a viewer to us. You are part of our family. Every time you watch, you bring your own heart and experiences into this community, and that is what makes soul-stirring stories so special. We truly love having you here with us. If this story touched your heart or brought a tear to your eye, please, we beg of you, don't keep it to yourself. Help us grow our family by liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you never miss a moment of healing. Share this story with someone in your life who might be going through a winter of their own right now. It might be the very ray of hope they need. And please, talk to us in the comments below. We read every single one because your voice matters to this family. We would love to know, where are you watching from today? Have you ever had a sitting down moment where a stranger's presence changed everything for you? Do you believe Darius truly earned his place as daddy? Or is some past damage too deep to repair?